Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. Our guest today is Kenneth D. Evans. He was a CPA and business consultant for more than 40 years. During his career, he helped set up and served as a board member on several nonprofit organizations, including an equine therapy center for people with disabilities and a foundation operating schools in Guatemala. He also assisted in interfaith disaster relief efforts following Hurricanes Beulah and Katrina. He is the author of Missing, a World War II story of love, friendships, courage, and survival. Is a biography of his father, Don Evans, pilot of a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber, shot down Christmas Eve, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, and taken prisoner by Nazi Germany. He survived his imprisonment as a POW in Stalag Luft I near the Baltic Sea and returned home a hero. Missing is a superb work. It is simply one of the finest and most engrossing accounts of World War II that this interviewer has ever read. And we are delighted to welcome author Kenneth D. Evans. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind words. It's good to be on.
When you started this project, did you have any idea how long it was going to take you?
Absolutely not. After my mother passed away, my father had passed away several years before that, my sister and I had discovered a box of over 300 letters that had chronicled my parents' early life, my father's early life, and from their dating years in high school, where they were sweethearts, up until he returned from the war. My mother saved all those letters along with a plethora of other memorabilia. And after discovering this box and reading the letters, obviously with 300 plus letters, it took some time to read them. And they were, I started to see and understand to a degree a life my father led before I was born. It was almost like a life in a unique time period. I initially wanted to excerpt the letters and the other. I found mission reports, journals that he had written when he was a POW during the war, and other letters, correspondence. And I wanted to summarize this so that it wouldn't be lost to my father's posterity. I wanted my children and my grandchildren to understand who he was and what he did and what many like him did. And so I started with just that intent. That changed as I started to share some of the experiences and stories that I came up with, or I was able to discover, some of which I had heard before and he'd shared with me, but many new things. As my CPA firm had a couple of noted best-selling authors, they encouraged me to consider writing what I was doing to a more general audience, expanded from my close family and friends. 10 years later, after returning from Europe as the final part of my research, where I was able to visit each of the locations where he fought from, flew from, where he was shot down, walked through the remnants of the prison camp that he was interned in, I published Missing. And it wasn't on my bucket list. It was nothing I ever intended to do. I don't think I'd written anything in any detail since college, other than some correspondence and research with the IRS, which was something no one would want to read. So that's kind of the synopsis of how I went from a retired fly fisherman to publishing a book.
In the introduction, you write, and I quote you, "My research, interviews, and writing have taken me on a long, meandering journey filled with serendipitous encounters and events, providing answers every time I hit a dead end." This is so full, so rich. You really did have maybe somebody watching over you on this one.
One of the individuals that I was able to reconnect with was my father's one of his closest friends throughout his life, and the only flyboy fighter pilot that he stayed in contact with after the war. In fact, yesterday, this individual, Bob Sharp, was named Veteran of the Day nationwide.
Ooh.
He's 98 years old and to this day has a great memory. But when I was, during my research, I discovered a letter that he had written to my mother. He went against not only protocol, but against directions and orders. And he knew her from earlier in their training. And he wrote in as much detail as he could about what happened to my father when he was shot down. It was classified information. He decided she needed to know, and the government wasn't telling her anything. And so he wrote to her. I found that letter, and it is one of the most touching correspondence from a 20-year-old young man that was in the middle of a war to his best friend's recent wife, newly married wife, that I've ever read. He lived in Northern California. I'm in Utah. I knew him when I was young because our families vacationed together and were pretty close. I got in contact with him, and he volunteered to help me recreate my father's story.
I should mention, as you kind of led up to, it's not just your father's story you tell. It's enriched by also including a significant information about his close pilot friends group called the Five, 3 from Utah, 2 from Missouri. I love the way you put it here. Quote, the chocolate milkshake drinking Mormons from Utah hit it off great with the 2 beer drinking roughnecks from Missouri. So well done. And it's no, and I should mention that we should talk about the influence of the LDS Church on shaping your father's character and how they helped out when it was time to get married. It was really touching.
He had volunteered and joined the Army Air Corps while he was in college with 3 of his roommates. They all wanted to be pilots. And at that point in time, the Air Corps required 2 years of college education before you could join. When the war started going sideways for the Allies in the United States, they threw that particular requirement out the window and called everyone up to active duty. My father was only 19 years old. My mother was 18. Neither one of them of age to be married. And they were madly in love. He had a really difficult time deciding whether or not he wanted to ask her to marry him. He knew both sets of parents would object, but love won out over logic. And he asked her, she accepted, and they kept it a secret until shortly before he was inducted and started his pilot training. Towards the end of his training, they were actually married. Their parents relented and gave them permission. In that decision-making process, they went to one of their church leaders and received guidance and a blessing that was very meaningful to both of them, stating that they would be able to survive the rigors of war, the hardships, the dangers that my father would face, and that if he were to live a life that merited such a blessing, that he would return home safely.
Yeah, that was it. The other thing I found very interesting was they got married in a small town in Texas where they knew no one, and the local church members turned out for the wedding and provided everything for them. It was really wonderful. It was a very, very moving part of the book for me.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. My mother, she hadn't seen my father for months during his training, and being still a teenager, she was up and down as to whether or not she was even going to follow through towards the end. And both mothers accompanied her on the train to San Angelo, Texas, and she wrote in her personal history that it took a push and a shove from her mother to get her to go down the steps, that she had got cold feet at the last minute.
Yeah.
But they were the people of Texas, she wrote, were among kindest and warmest and most uh, um, generous people that she had met, and they experienced that kindness from them.
Mhm. I also want to note something that struck me as I was reading this. Those of us baby boomers were pretty familiar with World War II. We grew up shortly after the war. It was still fresh in everyone's minds. We saw television shows, lots of movies about it, etc. But you didn't write this for us. You wrote this for generations yet to come. And the reason I say that is all through the book, where there were things that maybe the generation never heard of, you did an explanation beautifully woven in that gave context to everything, and that will let somebody reading this many years from now understand what all those terms meant and what the context was. So I really appreciated that.
Thank you. It was one of my goals to write something that would help even this generation, but future generations, to appreciate and understand what my father's generation did. They put their lives on the line. The entire country united in a way that I don't think we've seen possibly since then, for a common cause, for the common good, making sacrifices and doing things that everything they could to accomplish a common good, a common goal.
And even though I am fairly well read in World War II, there were lovely little tidbits that were new to me in this. And I want to share a couple of the things. I knew about rationing, sugar, gasoline, tires, etc. What I didn't know was that the national speed limit of 35 miles an hour was set up. I've never seen that fact before. And I'm thinking, I wonder how many people in the back roads kept up to that or not. But also, I knew many things were in short supply. I mean, you're in short supply when Coca-Cola has to stop production for a time because it can't get sugar and whatnot and cola nuts from South America. You said fascinating stuff. We'll talk a little bit about
if I might interject, one of the most humorous things that I found when I was talking to my mother about this in detail, because she worked for the Office of or the OPA, this federal organization that conducted the rationing, and she said that the young women painted their legs because they couldn't get nylons. They had a national drive going on where they donated nylons so they could use the material to make parachutes for the military. And she described what an ugly process that was.
Apparently, this is something I read someplace else, that the really, really good ones would actually be able to put a thin line representing the seam on the back of the stocking.
Well, they did. She said it was an art.
Yeah. The things that we sacrifice, and there really was common cause of all sorts on that. I have many, many pages of notes that I took while reading this because it is so rich in things. They also did something interesting. I thought you actually found an editorial cartoon talking about the Grim Reaper of carelessness, which took place during flight school as there were accidents in there. I thought that was a really interesting addition to have.
I discovered that one of the benefits of having the internet is there are people around the world that post interesting information. And there was a magazine that was being published in one of his training locations. And that was an editorial cartoon that they had preserved. It's no longer available. I can't find it anywhere. When I published my book, I wanted to try and get even a better copy or an original for my publisher. And it's disappeared. But I found so much information that had been preserved that was contemporaneous information that people had discovered and then posted. It was amazing to me.
Yeah. And are you comfortable if I ask you to read a short section of the book?
Sure.
Paragraph? Okay.
I think I have a book here.
Okay, you might be able to find one.
Okay.
All right, I'm looking at page 241, at least in my PDF of it. It's the little piece where he's coming back from one of the missions, and the crew chief shows him something kind of frightening that they found in the plane. It starts,
Yes.
my crew chief took me out. Yeah.
Right. Got it. My crew chief took me out with him to inspect my airplane after I reported in, saying he has something to show me that he thought I'd be interested in seeing. In the narrow protective lead plate located in the cockpit, right behind my head, there was a 1-inch hole with a large bullet still embedded in it, which didn't quite go all the way through the metal plate. The leading edge of the bullet had hit the back of my head, but in the heat of the battle, I didn't even feel it. If it had penetrated just a fraction of an inch further, it would have passed through the plate, killing me. This was another one of the many little miracles I experienced during the war.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. That was one of those aha wake up moments, I'm sure, certainly for us as readers. But all through there's the whole book. Through the whole book, there are wonderful photos. I don't know where you found all of those, but during training overseas, various people involved, of course, pictures of your folks. I think they also added to the richness and made for a visual aid to all the stuff that we're forming in our minds as we read. So thank you for that.
I'm glad you appreciate that. That was my intent, to hopefully to be able to enrich the story and personalize it by doing that. Bob Sharp, who I previously mentioned was named the Veteran of the Day nationwide yesterday, provided me with most of the pictures. He was one of the 5 that you mentioned that returned home, and he flew, I don't know, 100 and something missions and was awarded just about every commendation that you can get. He survived everything that he had, his mission reports, pictures, stories, and his assistance in helping me contact previous fighter buddies of my dad, and put me in touch with the historian that did the history of his fighter group. It was amazing that he was able to do that. And he was very open and willing. And I don't know if I could have written the book. I think the letters that my mother saved and the information and the help that I received from Bob Sharp were probably the 2 most important things in helping me to put it all together, to preserve what they still had access to. And almost every step of the way, when I hit a dead end, it seemed like a door opened and I was put in touch with someone else. One of the individuals he put me in contact with was in the last year of his life. I found out I was named after him. He was one of my father's best friends, one of the 5. And we were able to talk on the phone and correspond. And he shared stories. And it was a very interesting experience to get to know him.
Indeed. You mentioned this during the book, that how helpful he was, and I appreciate that. One of the things that kind of pulled all of this together was the fact that you have all of these sequential places where you can put in quotes from the letters that your father wrote that describe what life is like, how cold it was, moving from place to place, relocating, firing up, what was like the fears that we had. He was very open about writing all this stuff as it was happening. Of course, he was a young man at the time.
He was a great writer. My father was known for his sense of humor, for his wit. Some accused him of being a bit too sarcastic, but I don't know if you can be too sarcastic. It may be one of the lower forms of humor, but it's still humor. And he was criticized by my mother early on that he wasn't writing enough. And so he started writing everything that he could and tried to get everything that he could write through censors and my mother was a good writer as well. And the letter that I was able to find that she had written, and then her personal history that she wrote, they both told their story in a captivating way, at least to me.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things reviewers like to look for is what they call a telling detail that reveals character. And this quote seemed to be that for me. It says, Don spent endless hours stooped over a makeshift wooden crate, writing letters to Laura Jane, always using his fountain pen rather than a pencil with an eraser, required him to organize his thoughts carefully before putting pen to paper. Remarkably, he made few mistakes, seldom crossing out a line or a word. I think that's a telling detail about your father.
Yes. His buddies always, as I note in the book, at the end of letters, he would say, got to get the flashlight back to so-and-so, or I got to turn the lights out, or they're going to, I'm going to have repercussions. They want to get some sleep.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a letter almost every night to my mother.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times when he was returning, for example, back to the States after being released as a POW and coming across the Atlantic from Europe. He continued knowing that the letters weren't going to get there. It was his way of documenting his life. He continued to write daily letters to her during their journey. When he was waiting to be cleared so that he could return home, he continued to write every day. Some of the letters he posted, and they showed up after he got home, many of them. Others he never posted, knowing that he would beat them home. Mm-hmm. But it seemed to be his way of journalizing, documenting his experiences.
Mm-hmm. And we should talk a little bit about the prison camp itself. There were some pretty horrific things going on there. One of which was that a lot of the Red Cross care packages didn't get delivered to the prisoners as they ought to have. So, you know, it was pretty tough times in terms of very little food to eat. I bet you he didn't eat black bread again once he got home ever.
No, but the ode to black bread that he wrote, he started writing poetry. I had to include in my book. It is one of the most cleverly written histories written in poetry of his journey from when he was shot down, captured, went on the march, and the time that he spent in prison camp, which he attributed to black bread. When I discovered that, I couldn't get it out of my mind. It was hilarious, but he endured. The POWs none of them were treated well. At one point in time, they lost up to 40% of their body weight. The Red Cross packages there were still Red Cross packages in the Nazi warehouses, but they were not distributing them. Many have speculated why they did not, but they didn't. Much of their treatment was inhumane. Although my father did write about in his POW journals about one particular guard that he became close to, who had actually been in the States and out of kindness would sneak some food to them and accommodated communication. When he was discovered, he disappeared and they were told that he was executed. It was an inhumane period of time in a POW camp. The Germans, most of them were aware they were finally losing the war, and they had very little regard for human life.
What amazes me also is the ingenuity of the people in the POWs, putting out a newspaper, 2 newspapers actually, under the noses of them, and one filled with camp propaganda stuff, and the other actually the news of the war, because they had a radio in their hidden radio that they were able to get BBC and Voice of America broadcasts on. That's pretty amazing, actually.
It was incredible. I was so fascinated when I did quite a bit of research about that, but I wouldn't ever even known to consider it if I had not read about it in my father's POW journal that he wrote, contemporaneous while he was in the prison camp. The YMCA provided a blue notebook to each POW as they were interned. My father didn't smoke, many did, and so he traded his allotment of cigarettes whenever they showed up for additional writing materials, letter forms and the YMCA notebooks. And he wrote about that, and it was just fascinating to me that they were able to construct radios from parts that just how could you possibly even come up with the idea of doing it? I mean, it was incredible. And then to be able to hide them, the main radio, so it was never discovered. And it was the largest circulated newsletter during World War II in the European theater. And on one side, they were writing for the Nazis, who thought they were helping control the prisoners by doing a side journal, which included German propaganda, Nazi propaganda. And what it was a ruse, a front, so that they could publish their newsletter that they ingeniously distributed from one camp to another in the entire POW camp. It was fascinating to me.
Yeah, the ingenuity of people who are locked up a lot of time on their hands and a lot of motivation can come up with nearly everything. What did you hope that people would gain when they finish reading the book?
My hope is that people will get inside the story and to be able to understand what these young Americans and others that fought for freedom, the sacrifice that they made, and how they were willing to place important things and principles and values and sacrifice to preserve freedom. We take too much for granted today. I think I don't think there's an understanding or appreciation of what they and others have gone through, and in order to truly appreciate what we've got, I think you need to understand history.
Right. There is a reason that it's called the greatest generation. This is not hyperbole at all, because not just World War II, but they would just come out of the Depression prior to that. So these are young kids who had grown up in terrible times and went on to have even more terrible things going on in the war. So again, we really need to recognize that. I mean, I was lucky enough. My dad was in the South Pacific. I had an uncle who flew B-24s out of England. We had those people. They're going away. There are very few of them left these days that had that one-on-one. And books like this help tell their story, which is why I'm very appreciative of it.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything we haven't covered that you want to make sure gets out to our listeners and our viewers?
Well, maybe a couple of things. My father was, I write, the quintessential all-American boy. He was an all-state athlete in 3 sports. He was student body president. He had a bright future in front of him. And he gave it up to do what he did and what millions of other young Americans did. He at times was disillusioned. During his 200-mile forced march, I think he hit an all-time low. Inhumane treatment by guards, being starved, drinking out of ditches, dysentery, 14 days of inhumane treatment on his way to a POW camp. And at one of his lowest points, when he talked about hatred had entered into his heart for his enemy. He had a couple of experiences that were life-changing to him, where he experienced the kindness of a German lady. I write about it in the book. And later that day, the kindness of a group of German people in a small town who broke through the guard lines and provided them with food. It changed him. It changed the way he looked at humanity. Those experiences never left his mind. They helped shape who he became. And I'm confident that my father suffered most of his life with PTSD based on things that my mother shared with me, and just knowing him as well as I did. And yet experiencing everything that he did, seeing the worst of humanity, he was able to escape, come home from those horrors, and became a kind and a gentle man. And that's just a tribute to him, that we can overcome just about anything, and we can learn to deal with the worst hardships imaginable. And it's inspiring to me that he did that.
I'm so glad that you took the time, took the effort to put this out for other people, because this is going to be a very significant book down the road. This blends the personal, representing the much greater forces acting out throughout that time period, and is exceptionally well written. I want to thank you for spending time with us today, and really thank you for your effort on this book, and thank your dad for being such a cool guy. He's one of the nicest guys I never got a chance to meet. I'm sorry about that too. Our guest this morning has been Kenneth D. Evans. He is the author of Missing, a World War II story in love, friendship, courage, and survival. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.